Paul Thomas Anderson went to film school for 2 days. So he walks into one of his classes, and the very first thing that the teacher says is, if you're here to make Terminator 2, just walk out. Okay, you can leave my class, the door is over there. Paul Thomas Anderson didn't like that because what's wrong with Terminator 2? Terminator 2 is an awesome movie. So that's exactly what he did. He walked out, he left, he dropped out of NYU Film School after just 2 days, and then he went on to become one of the greatest directors of all time. Since then, he has multiple all-time classics under his belt, and just recently he came out with One Battle After Another, so I figured I'm going to rank all of his movies from worst to best. Licorice Pizza is this comedy drama that takes place in 1970s California. It's about this 15-year-old boy who's emotionally mature beyond his years, and this 25-year-old woman who is emotionally immature for her age. And listen, I love Paul Thomas Anderson's movies, one of my favorite directors, but I just do not enjoy Licorice Pizza whatsoever. This isn't one of those cases where he's never made a bad movie, in my opinion, and you have to pick something for last place, and it was really hard. Now, this was an easy decision because I actively dislike this movie. And I'm sorry to the Licorice Pizza fans out there, we have to get off on the wrong foot, but what can I say? I'm just not a fan. So first of all, the big controversy with this movie is the massive age gap between the two lead characters and how this movie kind of portrays it in a weird way. I'm not going to harp too much on this just because it would be kind of beating a dead horse at this point. All I'm going to say about this is that I understand Paul Thomas Anderson movies typically deal with dysfunctional, flawed characters. I don't think that this movie is necessarily endorsing anything about this, and I also don't think that directors are obligated to shy away from controversial material. But at the same time, I just really don't want to watch it. Ultimately, we all watch movies in our free time. This is not really what I want to spend my free time watching. And that's not to say that the movie doesn't have any merits, because Paul Thomas Anderson is very clearly a master at filmmaking at this point, and you can see it on display in Licorice Pizza. But I also do think that there are other movies in his filmography that better represent his skills as a filmmaker, and I'm going to be talking about those later anyway. What actually stands out the most about Licorice Pizza to me is the method that Paul Thomas Anderson seems to use when he's writing his scripts. So I saw this interview with George R.R. Martin where he describes two different types of writers. The first type of writer is the architect, and these are writers who meticulously plan out the entire story, the entire narrative structure, and then they kind of fill in the details later. And then the other type of writer is the gardener, and what gardeners do is they craft these characters, and then they kind of just naturally discover where the story goes from there. They don't have a plan of where the story's going to go. They just create the characters, and then they kind of see where it takes them. I would say Paul Thomas Anderson definitely fits more into the gardener category, and when it works, it ends up leading to some of these amazing character pieces, but then it does sometimes backfire, and the result is just a really messy and aimless narrative. And with Licorice Pizza, it's basically just a movie about nothing. Some people would call that a hangout movie, and there are a lot of really good movies that you could describe that way, but it is extremely difficult to pull it off. In order for it to work, you really have to be invested in the characters. And in this case, honestly, I just didn't care. Inherent Vice is a comedy noir movie about a stoner private investigator. It is this extremely convoluted noir movie, but honestly, you're not even really supposed to follow the entire convoluted plot because the main character in the movie, he doesn't even understand what's going on either. It's not even really the point of the movie. It pretty much just is a stoner comedy where you're hanging out with Joaquin Phoenix's character. I actually really do like some movies like this. I love The Big Lebowski, but it only works in that case because that movie is just so hilarious. Every scene in that movie is laugh out loud funny. Inherent Vice just doesn't have that going for it. Not to say that it doesn't have its moments. Paul Thomas Anderson is a very funny writer and director. Pretty much all of his movies are going to at least make me laugh out loud at some point. But Inherent Vice, even though the movie is kind of relying on being a comedy, I don't even think it's close to being his funniest movie. I definitely could get down with a Paul Thomas Anderson screwball comedy, but the thing is, he has a lot of other movies that I think are a lot funnier than Inherent Vice, and they're also just more compelling movies overall. I know a lot of people really love this movie, and I might have to give it another chance at some point, but as of right now, it's just not really my thing. Hard Eight. It's a crime drama about a man who mentors a gambler in Reno. And this was Paul Thomas Anderson's directorial debut. This was his first feature-length film. He was only 26 years old when he made it, and honestly, the most impressive thing about it He was this 26-year-old, and he's already working with people like Samuel L. Jackson, Gwyneth Paltrow, Philip Seymour Hoffman, John C. Reilly. I can't imagine working with all these famous people when you're only 26 years old. That's crazy. And the thing with this movie is that it gets massively overshadowed by all of the later movies that he went on to write and direct. Nobody really cares about Hard Eight at this point. But if you were to just randomly pick this movie up in a Walmart DVD bin and you had no idea what this movie was, you just popped it in and watched it, it's the kind of movie where you'd be like, oh yeah, like that was actually pretty good. I wasn't expecting that. It's a surprisingly decent movie. I mean, yeah, in the context of knowing it's a Paul Thomas Anderson movie and you're comparing it to all of his other stuff, obviously it doesn't stack up. At this point, Paul Thomas Anderson hadn't quite discovered his individual style yet, so this is definitely a lot more generic than all of his other movies, but it's still competently made. It's still a pretty enjoyable movie. The first half of the movie does kind of drag on a little bit, because pretty much half of the runtime out of the first half is people just chain smoking darts and talking about money and gambling and sex. It's really not that interesting. But then later on in the movie, there are actually some twists and turns. It gets a lot more interesting. And by the end of the movie, I actually was glad that I watched it. Magnolia. It's a drama that follows a huge ensemble cast of characters whose lives are all interconnected with each other. And now we're at the section where from here on out, everything else is a really good movie. Magnolia is not ranked this low because it's a bad movie or anything like that. It's really just because Paul Thomas Anderson's filmography is so stacked. Something has got to go in 7th place. The way this movie is formatted is that it's basically a bunch of different vignettes and they're all connected to each other, but it is a massive ensemble cast, and that is just an extremely difficult thing to actually pull off. And even in a 3-hour movie, that is just not a lot of time to be juggling that many characters. I think one of the reasons why Paul Thomas Anderson actually can pull it off and he can make it work in this movie is because he's so good at character development. He's one of the best directors when it comes to character studies, so that he's able to add a lot of characterization to these characters, even if they're not getting a lot of screen time individually. He just knows how to use every tool at his disposal to bring these characters to life in the most efficient way possible. But even if Paul Thomas Anderson can pull this off, I still do prefer it when he focuses in on one character, and instead of having a whole slew of pretty good characters, having one all-time great character. I just prefer that, even if it's not one character. He has a lot of other movies where there is kind of an ensemble, but it's not as sprawling as Magnolia. He's not juggling as many parts. I think he's just doing a little bit too much here. Yes, he can pull it off, but I just prefer it in his other movies where it's a little more focused. Phantom Thread. It's a period piece romance movie set in 1950s London about a dressmaker and his muse. I avoided this movie for way too long. I'll be honest, when this thing first came out, I saw the ultra posh period piece setting, and I just thought the movie looked kind of boring and I didn't really want to see it in theaters at the time. And I definitely regret that now, because this might actually be one of Paul Thomas Anderson's funniest movies, and that's saying a lot. Obviously, the entire visual aesthetic is absolutely beautiful. It also has this immaculate score by Johnny Greenwood, but the real driving force of this movie is the character Reynolds Woodcock, played by Daniel Day-Lewis. This guy's personality is pretty much exactly what you'd expect from a guy named Reynolds Woodcock. He has this massive stick up his ass, he's this little petulant jerk, he's pretty much just a Karen, and throughout the entire movie, he is the butt of the joke, and it's hilarious. Don't let the period piece setting and the costumes and all that fool you. This movie is pretty much a screwball comedy. And the same thing with Magnolia. Phantom Thread being ranked this low on my list is not even a reflection on Phantom Thread. It's an amazing movie. It's really, I just personally prefer his other movies better, but this is still a masterpiece in my opinion. Punch Drunk Love. It's this romance movie about this unhinged, lonely guy played by Adam Sandler, and he falls for a scam and ends up in some hot water. This movie is a perfect example of why Paul Thomas Anderson is a master at his craft and why he's so effective, because he uses every tool at his disposal to make the audience feel what the characters are feeling and really expose you to their psychology. So for example, this movie often uses cold lighting and this almost sterile color palette. It kind of makes you feel like you're in a psych ward, even if it's just a scene taking place at a grocery store or something. The camera is almost always moving in this slightly uneasy way, and then when the camera stops moving, that's when Adam Sandler's character starts moving in this uneasy way. There's this constant droning music playing in the background. The way this movie is filmed, it really just actually makes you feel this intense anxiety and nervous energy. And you never really know when Adam Sandler's character is just going to snap and start breaking shit. And every single time he does, it's just so funny. There's even a scene in this movie where all he's doing is ordering pudding over the phone, and yet it's this huge anxiety-inducing ordeal. It's almost more intense than a lot of thriller movies. It's a super tight 90-minute movie, extremely entertaining, and you have to watch this if you haven't seen it yet. The Master is this drama about a World War II veteran who returns home and then he ends up getting recruited into a cult, which it never really mentions it specifically, but it's basically Scientology. And one of the best parts of this movie is Joaquin Phoenix's character and his performance. This is easily Joaquin Phoenix's best performance in my opinion, and that's saying a lot because obviously he's an incredible actor. His character in this movie is basically the type of guy where you would always be on edge if you were in the same room with him. You really have no idea what this guy's gonna do or what's gonna randomly set him off. And it's not even just his actions, it's also his mannerisms, his facial expressions, the inflections in his voice, everything about this guy. You can just tell there's something wrong with him. He just comes off so incredibly unhinged. And you have to give a lot of credit to Joaquin Phoenix because he made it so believable. He really brought this character to life. And it's also just a hilarious movie because like this movie made me laugh out loud so many times just because of how deranged this guy is. Like Paul Thomas Anderson, he's so good at that because like the comedic timing of his outbursts, it's always perfect every single time. It's always funny. And this movie is also just so fascinating because you really understand the mindset that this character's in that allows him to get lured into the cult of Scientology. And also a big part of that is because of Philip Seymour Hoffman, one of the GOATs, because he just plays such a great L. Ron Hubbard in this, like the cult leader. It's just a really interesting movie. I will say though, this is probably one of Paul Thomas Anderson's least accessible movies because it doesn't really follow a typical narrative structure. It's not building up to any big climax. It doesn't have a neat and tidy resolution at the end. It pretty much just is a pure character study. And if you're not interested in that, you might not like it, but I think it really works. I think this movie is a masterpiece. One Battle After Another. It's a comedy, it's an adventure movie, it's an action thriller, and it's about a former revolutionary and his daughter. I'm going to be as vague as possible and avoid spoilers. I know that this might seem like insane recency bias to have this ranked at number 3, especially ahead of The Master, which a lot of people consider to be Paul Thomas Anderson's best work. There definitely is a huge hype train around this movie, especially among critics and movie nerds and stuff like that. I've seen a lot of people calling this the movie of the decade, one of the greatest movies of the 21st century. I'm not trying to hype it up that much, okay? I don't necessarily think that this is Paul Thomas Anderson's most well-made movie. I'm not going to go as far as to say that this is the epitome of all of cinema in the last decade. I'm going to at least have to rewatch this a few more times and let it sit before I'm willing to make any statements like that. The main reason why I have this ranked so high ahead of The Master, honestly, is pretty much just pure entertainment value. I actually probably appreciate The Master a little bit more as a work of art. I think it's a deeper dive into a character and just overall kind of a more impressive movie. But I just enjoy One Battle After Another more. I think it's more fun to watch. As chaotic as this movie is with all these different wacky characters and all these different moving parts, the actual core story of this movie is extremely simple, and it's a very classic story that's been done a million times before. Some people might use that as a knock against this movie and say that it's a lot more formulaic than a lot of his other movies, but I actually think it really works in this case because it really helps the movie have this constant momentum. It's such a bizarre and crazy movie, but it's always kept grounded by this very conventional father-daughter story, and that just really helps it work as this action thriller with a lot of heart to it. With that being said, this movie is definitely going to piss a lot of people off. In my theater, there was a group of people who walked out after the first 20 minutes. Then there was another group of people who walked out about halfway through the movie. And then after the movie was over, I overheard these two old ladies talking and they were just angrily ranting about this movie. And I heard one of them say, she was like, "I'm so sorry that I brought you to this movie. I had no idea what we were getting into." How I would describe it, it's almost like Grand Theft Auto, but if it were a movie. Because it takes place in modern America, but it kind of just dials everything up to this level of absurdity. So if you're someone who's really eagerly awaiting GTA 6, I actually think this is a pretty good movie to hold you over. It kind of scratches the same itch. The movie is pretty much pure chaos from start to finish. It's absolutely hilarious, and it's got some of the coolest car chases I've ever seen on the big screen. Oh yeah, and there's also Steely Dan and Mo Bamba needle drops in the same movie. There's a Battle of Algiers reference. When I was watching this, I feel like I now understand what MCU fans feel whenever there's cameos in Avengers movies. I'm not going to come in here and tell you that this is the greatest movie of the decade, that is Paul Thomas Anderson's finest work. I think it's a little too early to say that. I think we have to let it sit for a little bit to see how it ages. but I can assure you that this movie is insanely entertaining. There Will Be Blood. It's a drama character piece about the rise of an oil baron and his feud with a local preacher. And for a movie that is basically only about two major characters, this thing feels like such a massive American epic. I guess you could say that the conflict between this oil baron and this preacher kind of encapsulates capitalism versus religion. And the movie also has these massive set pieces, so it all makes the movie feel like it's on this grand scale. But really what makes this movie so great is it's just the personal feud between these two characters. Personally speaking, I just love a good feud in a movie. It's one of my favorite types of stories. I think There Will Be Blood is probably the best movie that has that type of story. And obviously Daniel Day-Lewis is the big highlight of the movie. He's considered one of the greatest actors of all time for a reason, but Paul Dano also deserves a lot of the credit. This might sound bad because as despicable as Daniel Day-Lewis's character is in this, sometimes you can kind of get where he's coming from. You understand why he hates this preacher so much. You're just watching Paul Dano's character in this and you can't help but think like how much of a little weasel this guy is. And obviously that's not to justify Daniel Day-Lewis's character. He's a total psycho in this, but you do kind of get it a little bit. Both of them suck. So if you're the type of person who needs to have a likable, rootable character in a movie in order for you to connect with it, you're probably not going to enjoy There Will Be Blood too much because like the major characters in this movie are just incredibly unlikable. They're fascinating. They're incredibly well-developed characters, but yeah, they're horrible people. And obviously everyone who's seen the movie knows exactly about how great the ending of this thing is. I'm not going to spoil it, but it's got one of the most iconic movie quotes of all time. It's just so perfect. It's hilarious. It's iconic. It just is a perfect way to end the movie. A lot of people consider this as Paul Thomas Anderson's magnum opus, and I can't really argue with that. I think it 100% deserves that reputation. Boogie Nights, a period piece that takes place in late 70s, early 80s California. And it's about this guy who gets recruited into the adult film industry and all the shenanigans that ensue after that. And don't let the subject matter fool you, because yes, this movie can get incredibly dark at times. It is also a very delightful and entertaining movie. I will admit that this being ranked as number one is a lot of nostalgia bias. This was my introduction to Paul Thomas Anderson. I've seen this movie so many times. I've always loved it. And even though this movie can get extremely dark in certain moments, it is kind of a comfort movie for me. Do I think that this is Paul Thomas Anderson's most well-made movie? Not really, and that's not to take away from how great it is, but he only made this when he was like 27 years old. He still hadn't quite figured out everything at this point. It's an amazing movie, but there's so many different tricks that he learned over the years after this movie. He didn't quite have that in his repertoire yet, but I mean, it is still insane that this was his second feature-length movie and he was only 27 when he made this. This is still an iconic movie to this day. Boogie Nights just has such immaculate vibes. I know Paul Thomas Anderson has gone back to that 70s, 80s setting a number of times, like in Licorice Pizza and Inherent Vice, but I think Boogie Nights just captures it in the most magical way, and I think a lot of that is owed to the characters. You see this in a lot of PTA movies where there's a found family element to it, and I think out of all of his movies, Boogie Nights still does it in the most endearing way. And one thing I think is really cool about this movie is that it has these moments that are really dark, but I actually think that that makes the happy moments hit even harder, and overall, it's just a very entertaining movie. And the best scene in the movie is that scene at the end with Alfred Molina's character. Honestly, that might be my favorite scene in his entire filmography. It's just so funny yet so intense at the same time, and I feel like pretty much everyone has met someone like that at some point in their life. You know what I'm saying? One of those people who's like this larger-than-life character, they're really funny, they're kind of charismatic, but you can also tell that there's something a bit off about them. You just don't really know what's going to set them off. You can just tell that they're kind of unhinged. So yeah, realistically, I don't think Boogie Nights is his best, most well-made movie, but that's just kind of why it's my personal favorite. All right, that's it. Let me know your favorite Paul Thomas Anderson movie.